she didn't hide her hands. Robert Haynes had walked onto the floor of his own steel mill at 6 in the morning. Unannounced, no security detail, just a man in a $3,000 suit stepping into 14,400 degrees of heat and noise and molten light. And the first thing he saw was a woman who didn't hide her hands. The scars ran across both palms. Not one accident. Not one documented incident that appeared in a safety report. 6 years of small burns accumulated one shift at a time, each one minor enough to treat with the first aid kit on the wall and go back to work. The total of them, a record written directly onto skin. She was 38 years old. She had worked his machines for 6 years. She had never once been asked what she thought about anything. Robert stood 10 feet away and looked at those hands and felt something he had not felt in the 30 years. He had spent building Haynes Industrial Group into a $1.4 billion company. Shame, not guilt. Shame. The specific bodily shame of a man who grew up watching his father come home from a steel mill with hands that looked exactly like hers, and who had built an empire on the labor of people like his father, and who had not once in 30 years walked onto a floor and actually looked. He was looking now. And what Diane Carter said to him in the next 40 minutes was going to cost him more than he expected and change more than he planned. Starting with the question he should have been asking for 30 years and never had. And that she answered the way only someone who had lived inside the answer for 6 years could answer it, with her whole body, her whole history, and nothing left to lose by telling the truth. Diane Carter's alarm went off at 9:47 p.m., not a.m. p.m. While Pittsburgh was finishing dinner, settling into the couch, putting kids to bed, Diane Carter was waking up for work. She had been waking up at 9:47 p.m. for 6 years. The first year, the reversal had been disorienting in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not just the schedule, the specific wrongness of sleeping when the sun was up and working when it was down, missing the ordinary daytime texture of the world, existing permanently out of phase with everything and everyone around her. Parent-teacher conferences on 4 hours of broken sleep, grocery runs at 3 a.m. Doctor's appointments rescheduled 3 times because they were always during her sleep hours. The second year, she stopped noticing. That was the thing nobody told you about night shifts. Not the tiredness. Everyone told you about the tiredness. The thing nobody told you was that eventually the wrongness became normal. The 9:47 a.m. alarm became just the alarm. The darkness outside the window when she left for work became just the morning she was leaving into. The body adapted, and somewhere in that adaptation, something she hadn't yet named, the loss of ordinary time, the specific irreplaceable texture of a life lived in daylight hours when everyone else was also awake, became simply the cost of the work. She paid it. Every night for 6 years, she paid it. She dressed in the dark, not to avoid waking Marcus. He slept soundly, always had, which she had long considered a specific mercy in a life that hadn't offered many. She dressed in the dark because the light hurt in those first minutes of waking. And because she had learned to move through the apartment at night the way she moved through the mill floor, by memory, by touch, by the knowledge of someone who had occupied the same space long enough to know it without looking. Work clothes first. The underlayers, not the gear, that was at the mill, in her locker. The flame-resistant jacket, the face shield, the heat-resistant gloves she had replaced twice in 6 years, because heat-resistant was a relative term when the work involved operating machinery at 1,400 degrees Celsius, just the underlayers. The clothes washed every 2 days, the specific faded gray of fabric that had been through industrial laundry enough times to lose any other color it once had. Then she checked on Marcus. She always checked on Marcus before she left. He slept on his left side with one arm under the pillow and his drawing notebook on the nightstand, kept there because the first thing he wanted when he woke up was to draw, and having it close meant the idea didn't have to wait. She stood in the doorway long enough to see the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Present, safe, sleeping. Then she left. The mill was 40 minutes by bus. She drove on days she could afford the gas and took the bus on days she couldn't. And the calculation of which days were which was part of the same ongoing math that governed everything. Rent, utilities, Marcus's school lunch account, The specific rotating triage of which expense could be deferred and which could not. Tonight was a bus night. She sat near the back, the only passenger for most of the route, the bus moving through a Pittsburgh that belonged entirely to people on their way to or from the night shift. Nurses, warehouse workers, security guards, the invisible workforce that kept the city operational while the rest of it slept. The mill floor at midnight was its own world. Temperature, noise, light, all beyond the scale of ordinary experience. The heat was not the heat of a hot day or a hot room. It was the heat of proximity to something running at wafting 400 degrees, felt on exposed skin from 15 feet away, making the air shimmer above the casting floor. The noise was total. The low, constant roar of furnaces, the percussion of machinery, the specific metallic sound of steel moving through the rolling mill that she had learned to read like rhythm over 6 years, which sounds were normal, which were slightly off, which needed attention before they became problems. She had saved the mill from 2 significant equipment failures in 6 years. Both times she heard something before the monitoring systems flagged it. Both times she reported it. The problem was fixed. She received a safety commendation, a printed certificate, her name on it, Haynes Industrial Group logo at the top, signed by a plant manager she had met twice. The certificates were in a folder in the kitchen drawer. She had not framed them. The scars on her hands had not come from one accident, not one documented incident that produced a clear before and after. 6 years of small burns, one shift at a time, each minor enough to treat with the first aid kit on the wall and go back to work. The total of them visible only when you looked at both hands together and understood that this pattern didn't come from a single moment. It came from 6 years. From the unavoidable physics of working with molten steel, the way even full protection had gaps, the way flame-resistant was not flame-proof, the way the machinery sometimes did something unexpected, and the distance between the gear and the skin was smaller than the specifications said it should be. She had reported every incident on the forms in the safety office, reviewed quarterly, fed into metrics, appeared in reports that went to management, that went to the board, that measured the mill's safety performance against industry benchmarks. The benchmarks said the Pittsburgh mill was performing adequately. The benchmarks did not have hands. Marcus was 9 years old, and he did not ask why his mother slept during the day. This was the thing that broke Diane in the quiet way. Things break you when there is no drama in them. When the thing that costs the most arrives not as a crisis, but as ordinary acceptance. He had simply learned. The way children learn the specific geography of their circumstances without being taught. He did his homework between 4 and 6 p.m. before she woke, because those were the quiet hours and he didn't want to disturb her sleep. He made his own breakfast on school mornings. Cereal, or toast, or the eggs she had taught him to scramble when he was 7. Because she had decided that a boy who could feed himself had one fewer thing to worry about. He set his alarm for 7:15 and got himself to the bus stop without fail. 9 years old, getting himself to school because his mother worked nights and needed to sleep, and he understood this the way he understood gravity. Not as something to question, but as a fact of the world that required adjustment. Diane understood what this cost him. Not in complaints or resentment, in the drawings. Marcus drew constantly. His teacher had called in February to say he had genuine artistic talent that should be developed, the kind that would be a shame to leave unfostered. Diane had thanked her. She had not said that the art supplies cost $40 she didn't currently have. 3 months ago, she had found a drawing tucked into the back of his notebook, not on the refrigerator with the others. Hidden, slightly in the way children hide things they're not sure they should have made. She almost didn't look. She was glad she did, and she was not glad she did. The drawing showed a figure in a bed, sleeping. The room around the figure was dark. Marcus had shaded everything with the side of his pencil, pressing graphite in broad sweeps to fill the space with gray. The figure was clearly a woman, clearly her. In the window, visible through the shading, was a sun, full, bright, rays extending carefully outward. Unambiguously, completely daytime, his mother, sleeping, in the dark, while the sun was out. He had not shown it to her. He had tucked it in the back of the notebook because he was 9 years old and understood, in the way children understand things they have no words for, that some truths were too heavy to hand directly to the person they were about. Diane put the drawing back exactly where she found it. She went to work that night, stood at her station, operated the machinery, did the job. She cried on the bus home. 3 minutes. Then she looked out the window at Pittsburgh coming awake in the early morning light, and she thought about what it would take to change the math. The night shift wage, Marcus's art supplies, the safety commendations in a folder in the drawer. And she thought, not yet, but not never. She was still here, still trying. And if you know someone who has been paying this kind of cost in the dark, without asking anyone to notice, stay with me, subscribe if you're new, because this story is far from over. Robert Haynes had not visited the Pittsburgh mill in 14 months. Not because he didn't care about Pittsburgh, because he had 11 facilities across 3 states, and a board that met quarterly, and an executive team of 14 people whose job was to ensure he never had to be in more than 2 places at once. And Pittsburgh had not generated the kind of numbers that required his personal attention in over a year. Good numbers kept you away. That was the specific, invisible logic of running a company at the scale Haynes Industrial had become. The places that were working didn't need you, and the places that needed you were by definition the places where something was going wrong. So you moved toward the problems and away from the functioning, and over time the functioning places became abstractions. Facilities, locations, lines on a spreadsheet that produced satisfactory outputs quarter after quarter until the day they didn't. Pittsburgh had been satisfactory for 14 months. Robert had not looked at it directly in 14 months. He was 61 years old, and he had built Haynes Industrial Group from a single scrap metal operation in Allentown, Pennsylvania in 1987 into a company with $4 billion in annual revenue, 4,000 employees, and a reputation in the American steel industry as the operation that other operations benchmarked against when they wanted to understand what efficient looked like. Efficient. That word had appeared in more descriptions of Haynes Industrial than any other. In the trade publications, in the investor presentations. In the profile, Forbes had run in 2019 that had used the word 4 times in the first 3 paragraphs, and that word had kept a copy of in his office, not because he was vain about it, but because the word had felt when he read it like an accurate description of what he had spent 34 years trying to build. He had grown up in Braddock, Pennsylvania, 8 miles from the Pittsburgh mill. His father, Thomas Haynes, had worked at Edgar Thomson Steel Works for 31 years. Not management, not engineering, not any of the positions that appeared in the company's promotional materials. He had worked the floor. He had come home every night with the specific smell that steel work produced, a smell that Robert had never been able to fully describe to people who hadn't grown up with it. Metallic, hot, with something underneath that was almost organic, the smell of something being fundamentally transformed. His father's hands had been rough, not scarred the way Diane Carter's hands were scarred. His father had worked an earlier era with different equipment and different protocols, and the specific accumulation of small burns that marked Diane's hands was not exactly his father's story, but the roughness was the same. The specific texture of hands that had spent decades in industrial work, that had been subjected to heat and pressure, and the particular physical demands of a job that used the body as a primary tool. Robert had held those hands. As a child, walking with his father to the corner store on Saturday mornings, the one non-work morning, the one morning Thomas Haynes moved through the world at a pace that wasn't determined by a shift schedule. Robert had held his father's hand and felt the roughness of it, and had not thought anything specific about it. It was just his father's hand. It was just how hands felt. He had not thought about his father's hands in a long time. He had built a company. He had become, by any objective measure, the thing his father's labor had made possible. The generation that got out of the mill, that turned the blue-collar sacrifice of the previous generation into the white-collar achievement of the next. His mother had been proud in the specific, emotional way of a woman who had watched her husband come home exhausted every night for 31 years and had prayed that her son would find a different way. He had found a different way. He had then bought mills, That irony had not escaped him entirely. He had thought about it occasionally, in the early years, when the distance between where he'd come from and where he was going was still short enough to see clearly. He had told himself, and believed, that the difference was that he would run them better, more efficiently, more safely, with the specific informed care of someone who understood from the inside what the work cost the people doing it. He had run them efficiently. He was not certain, standing in the lobby of the Pittsburgh mill on a Tuesday morning in March, whether he had run them with care. The visit had not been planned. That was the truth of it, and it mattered, not as an excuse, but as context. He had been driving back from a meeting in Uniontown and had taken the 376 back into the city and had passed the exit for the mill and had, for reasons he did not fully examine in the moment, taken it. No call ahead, no security detail, no prepared presentation from the plant manager. Just Robert Haynes, in a suit that cost more than some of his workers made in a month, walking through the front entrance of a facility he owned and had not personally visited in 14 months. The lobby guard had recognized him immediately and called upstairs. By the time Robert reached the floor, the plant manager, a competent, earnest man named Gary Shields, who had run the Pittsburgh operation for 7 years, was already moving toward him with the expression of someone who was not prepared for this, but was professionally trained to appear as though he was. "Mr. Haynes, we weren't expecting." "I know," Robert said. "I want to walk the floor." Gary had walked him through, efficiently, professionally, narrating the operation with the fluency of someone who knew his numbers and his processes and his safety metrics and was accustomed to presenting them to people who evaluated the facility through the lens of those numbers. Robert had listened. And then, somewhere in the middle of the casting floor, he had stopped listening to Gary and started listening to the mill itself. The heat, the noise, the specific quality of work happening around him, not the abstraction of it, the metrics version, the lines on the spreadsheet, but the actual physical reality of what it meant to stand in this environment for 10 hours, to operate this machinery, to manage, shift after shift, the specific demands of a job that required complete physical and mental presence in an environment that was, by definition, hostile to the human body. He looked at the workers. Really looked. Not the way you look when you are being taken on a tour and the tour has a destination. The way you look when you stop moving and let your eyes rest on what is actually in front of you. He saw a woman at a station near the rolling mill. She was moving with the specific, practiced efficiency of someone who had done this work long enough that the individual actions had merged into a single fluid motion. Reach, check, adjust, monitor, repeat. The kind of fluency that comes from years, not months. The kind that effortless from the outside and is anything but. She had not noticed him yet. He watched her work for a full minute before she turned. When she did, her eyes met his without adjustment. No performance of busyness. No recalibration for the presence of someone in a suit. She simply looked at him the way she looked at the machinery, directly, with assessment, with the unhurried attention of someone who had learned that looking carefully at things before acting on them was the difference between a smooth shift and an incident report. And that was when he saw her hands, both of them visible in the light of the casting floor, resting for a moment on the edge of the station, the scars running across the palms. Not hidden, not displayed, just there, the way everything about Diane Carter was just there, present, unmediated, making no argument for itself beyond the simple fact of its existence. Robert felt something move in his chest. Not pity. Not the managed, comfortable version of concern that appeared in corporate communications about worker welfare and safety commitment, and the value Haynes Industrial placed on the people who made the company possible. Something older and more specific than any of that. He thought about his father's hands on a Saturday morning. He thought about 34 years of building something on the labor of people whose hands looked like hers, and the specific distance he had traveled from Braddock, Pennsylvania, to a $1.4 billion company, and whether the efficiency he had spent 34 years perfecting had accounted for all the costs. The benchmarks said yes. Standing 10 feet from Diane Carter, looking at her hands in the light of the casting floor, Robert Haynes was no longer certain the benchmarks were measuring the right things. He took a step toward her. "Excuse me," he said. She looked at him. "How long have you worked this floor?" he asked. 6 years, she said. Her voice was even. Not suspicious, not warm. Just accurate, the way everything about her was accurate. 6 years, he repeated. He looked at her hands. She did not move them, did not pull her sleeves down or turn her palms inward or do anything to make the conversation easier for either of them. She just waited. And in that waiting, in the specific patience of a woman who had nothing to prove and nothing to hide and had learned long ago that the truth about her work was written on her hands whether she showed it or not. Robert Haynes understood that whatever he said next mattered more than anything he had said in a boardroom in a very long time. Robert had been on dozens of facility tours in 34 years. He knew what they looked like from the inside. The way plant managers walk slightly ahead, narrating continuously, directing attention toward the things that told the story they wanted told. The upgraded equipment, the safety record, the efficiency metrics, the workers who happened to be near enough to observe and who understood, without being told, that this was an observation moment and adjusted accordingly. He had participated in this choreography hundreds of times, had accepted the narrated version of his own facilities as the accurate one, the way people accept the menu description of a dish as a reliable guide to what will arrive at the table. Efficient, safe, performing adequately. He had stopped moving through the Pittsburgh mill at 11:47 in the morning. Not because Gary Shields had suggested it. Gary had not suggested it. Gary had continued narrating for approximately 30 seconds after Robert stopped walking before he understood, from the specific quality of Robert's stillness, that the tour portion of the morning had ended and something else had begun. Gary had stepped back. Robert stood in the middle of the casting floor and looked, not at the metrics, not at the output numbers or the efficiency ratings or the safety benchmarks that said the Pittsburgh mill was performing adequate, at the floor itself, at the people on it, at the specific physical reality of what it meant to work in this environment for 10 hours, 4 nights a week, for 6 years. The heat first. From where he stood, the temperature near the casting equipment was documented at approximately 48 degrees Celsius at the worker stations. That number appeared in the safety reports. It was within acceptable parameters. It was a number. Standing in it, in a suit that was already showing the effects after 12 minutes, Robert understood that 48 degrees Celsius was not a number. It was a physical fact that operated on the body continuously, relentlessly, for the duration of every shift, demanding constant physiological adaptation that extracted a cost that did not appear in any report. The noise next. The mill operated at approximately 95 decibels on the floor. The safety standard required hearing protection above 85 decibels. The workers wore protection. The protection mitigated the exposure. It did not eliminate it. 95 decibels through protection for 10 hours, 4 nights a week for 6 years produced the kind of cumulative hearing impact that didn't show up in annual audiograms until it was already irreversible. Diane Carter was back at her station. He watched her work. She moved with a precision that was not mechanical. Not the precision of someone following a procedure, but the precision of someone who had internalized a process so completely that they were simultaneously executing it and monitoring it, running a continuous assessment of the machinery and the material and the environment that most people in that building didn't have the experience to run. She caught things. He could see it from where he stood. The small adjustments, the brief pauses before a decision, the specific quality of attention that separated someone who worked a machine from someone who understood it. She had saved the mill twice. He knew that now. Gary had told him during the tour, as part of the safety record presentation, had mentioned it with the specific pride of a manager presenting a data point. 2 potential equipment failures, caught early, significant cost avoidance, safety commendations issue. Cost avoidance. That was how it had been categorized. Robert looked at Diane Carter's hands. The cost avoidance had been calculated. The cost to her hands had not been. He walked toward her. She saw him coming and she did not change what she was doing. Finished the task she was in the middle of. A specific check of the rolling mechanism that she performed with the methodical completeness of someone who understood that half-finished checks were worse than no check at all. And then she looked at him. "You're Robert Haynes," she said. Not a question. She had recognized him, not from personal acquaintance, but from the photograph on the wall of the HR office, which every worker in the Pittsburgh mill had passed hundreds of times on the way to or from something else. "Yes," he said. "You own this place." "Yes." She looked at him the way she had looked at him before, directly, with assessment, with no performance layered over. Then she went back to her work. Robert stood beside her station. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She glanced at him, not stopping. "You can ask. How long has it been since anyone from the company came down here and watched what you actually do?" She thought about it, not performing consideration, actually thinking. "Gary comes through every shift," she said. "Supervisors are on the floor constantly." "I don't mean supervisors," Robert said. "I mean someone from the company who makes decisions about how this floor operates." She was quiet for a moment. "You're the first person from upstairs who's been on this floor in the time I've worked here," she said. 6 years. 6 years, Robert said nothing. "Can I ask you something?" Diane said. He looked at her. "Why today?" she said. 14 months since your last visit, according to the log in the front office. Why today specifically? He hadn't expected that. Not the question itself, the precision of it. She knew the number. 14 months. She had noticed his absence the way you notice the absence of something that should be present. Not dramatically, just accurately, in the specific register of someone who paid attention to what the world around her actually contained rather than what she was told it contained. "I drove past the exit," he said, "and I took it." She looked at him for a moment. "That's honest," she said. "The scars on your hands," Robert said. He had not planned to say it directly. It came out because the alternative was to not say it, and he had spent 14 months not saying things about this facility and had driven past the exit today instead of past it, and was standing on a floor that was 48 degrees Celsius in a suit that was already suffering for it. "What about them?" she said, still working. Not defensive. Not performing anything. "How many incidents? Reported or actual?" He went still. "There's a difference," he said. She looked at him then. Not the assessment look, something more direct. The look of a person deciding, in real time, how honest to be with someone who has asked a question that has a real answer, and may or may not want to receive it. "Reported incidents go on forms," she said. "Forms go to the safety office. Safety office sends metrics to management. Management uses metrics to measure performance against benchmarks." She paused. "Small burns, anything that doesn't require more than first aid and doesn't pull you off the line. A lot of workers don't report those because reporting means paperwork. Paperwork means the supervisor is involved. Being involved means questions about whether you were following protocol, and if you were following protocol and it happened anyway, that means the protocol is the problem." She looked at her hands. "And nobody wants to be the person who says the protocol is the problem." Robert looked at her hands. The scars that were there because incidents had not been reported. Because the system that was supposed to capture the cost of the work had been designed in a way that made accurate reporting inconvenient for the people most directly affected by the thing being reported. The benchmark said the Pittsburgh mill was performing adequately. The benchmarks were measuring the reported incidents. He thought about the safety reports on his desk in Philadelphia, the quarterly summaries, the metrics that compared Pittsburgh favorably against industry standards, the specific, comfortable confidence he had derived from those numbers, the sense that the system was working, that the people on this floor were protected, that Haynes Industrial was doing what a responsible company did. He thought about 48 degrees Celsius. He thought about 14 months. He thought about a woman who had saved his mill twice and whose contributions had been categorized as cost avoidance, and whose hands told a story that his safety reports did not. "How many people on this floor know things that aren't in any report?" he asked. Diane looked at him steadily. "All of them," she said. One word, all of them. Robert Haynes stood on the floor of his own mill and felt the specific, uncomfortable weight of a man who had built a reputation for efficiency and was beginning to understand that efficiency and accuracy were not the same thing, and that he had, for a very long time, been confusing the two. Gary Shields appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Haynes, We have the quarterly review materials prepared upstairs whenever you're... Cancel it, Robert said. Gary blinked. Sir? The quarterly review. Cancel it. Robert looked at Diane. I'd like to keep talking to your workers, starting here. He paused. Actually, starting with Ms. Carter, Diane said. Diane Carter. Starting with Ms. Carter, Robert said, if she's willing. Gary looked at Diane. Diane looked at Robert. I have 40 minutes before my break ends, she said. Then we have 40 minutes, Robert said. Gary retreated. The casting floor continued around them. Heat, noise. The constant controlled motion of a facility in full operation, indifferent to the specific conversation happening beside Station 7, between the CEO and the woman whose hands told the story his reports had been leaving out. Diane Carter had 40 minutes. She had been waiting 6 years to use them. Diane had given presentations before, not in conference rooms, not with slides or a podium or any of the formal apparatus that turned information into performance. In break rooms, in parking lots after shifts, in the specific compressed conversations that happened between workers who had limited time and a lot to say. She had explained things to new hires, had walked supervisors through equipment behavior that wasn't in the manual, had described to the safety officer 3 times in 6 years why the incident reporting form didn't capture what actually happened on the floor. The safety officer had thanked her each time. Nothing had changed. She understood, standing beside her station with Robert Haynes waiting, that this was a different conversation, not because he was more important than the safety officer. Importance was not the variable that had determined whether her previous conversations produced change. The variable was whether the person listening had the power to act on what they heard and the willingness to use it. Robert Haynes had the power. Whether he had the willingness she did not yet know. She decided to find out. The heat, she said. Start there. He nodded. The safety standard says 48 degrees Celsius at the worker stations is within acceptable parameters, she said. That number is accurate. It's also incomplete. She picked up a temperature gauge from the edge of her station. The kind workers used to check equipment, not the kind that appeared in the official readings. The official measurement is taken at a fixed 0.6 feet from the casting equipment. The worker position is here. She moved 18 inches closer to the machinery. At the actual work position, during peak operation, the temperature runs between 54 and 58 degrees. She held up the gauge. I've been documenting it for 2 years. Robert looked at the gauge. Why haven't you reported this? He said. I have, she said. 3 times. On the standard incident forms, which ask for the official temperature reading, not the position-specific reading, she put the gauge down. The form wasn't designed to capture the difference, so the difference doesn't exist in any report. Robert was quiet. The gloves next, she said. She held up her hands. Not to display the scars, just held them up. The way you hold up evidence when you want someone to look at what the evidence actually shows rather than what they expected to see. The heat-resistant gloves were issued, are rated for contact with surfaces up to 260 degrees Celsius, she said. The casting equipment surface temperature during operation runs between 400 and 480 degrees. She let that sit for a moment. The gloves are compliant with the safety specification. The safety specification was written based on equipment that is now 22 years old. The equipment was upgraded in 2014. The safety specification was not reviewed after the upgrade. Who is responsible for reviewing the specification? Robert said. The safety committee, she said, which meets quarterly. The last review of the glove specification was in 2019. The next scheduled review is in the 3rd quarter of this year. She looked at him. In the time between the 2014 equipment upgrade and today, there have been 47 documented hand injuries on this floor. The form asks for the cause. The cause field says equipment contact in 31 of the 47 cases. She paused. The form does not ask whether the protective equipment was adequate for the equipment being used. 47 documented injuries. Robert wrote nothing down. He had no notepad. He had come to this floor unannounced and unprepared, and he was receiving information that his quarterly reports had not contained, and he was receiving it from a woman who had documented it herself, in her own time, on her own initiative, because the system that was supposed to capture it had not been designed to do so. The scheduling, Diane said. Tell me, 10-hour shifts, 4 nights a week. That's the standard contract. The actual average in this facility over the past 3 years has been 11.3 hours per shift. Due to mandatory overtime when the crew is understaffed, she looked at him. Mandatory overtime is compensated at the standard rate, not the overtime rate, because the contract designates it as scheduled flex time rather than unscheduled overtime. She paused. The workers know the difference. The contract language doesn't reflect it. Robert looked at her. How do you know the average shift length? He said. I tracked it, she said. 18 months of time cards. Mine and 8 other workers on this floor who agreed to let me use their data. She reached into her jacket pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. Small, dense with handwriting. The specific handwriting of someone accustomed to capturing a lot of information in a small space. She held it out. He took it. The paper contained 18 months of shift data. Start times, end times, scheduled versus actual. The calculation at the bottom in small, precise figures. Average actual shift length 11. 3 hours. Average compensation 10 hours. The gap. 1. 3 hours per shift, 4 shifts per week, 50 weeks per year. 260 hours annually per worker. Uncompensated. He looked at the number. This is your handwriting, he said. Yes. You did this yourself. Yes. Why? She looked at him for a moment. Not performing patience, actually considering how to answer a question that had a real answer she wasn't sure he was ready for. Because someone had to, she said. And because I have a son who is 9 years old, and I have worked this floor for 6 years, and I intend to still be working it when he is 18, and I would like the conditions under which I work it to be accurately described somewhere before that happens. She paused. The safety office has forms. The forms have fields. The fields were designed by people who don't work this floor. The data that those fields produce is accurate within the limits of what the fields can capture. She looked at her hands. What my hands look like is not in any field. Robert held the paper. The handwriting on it was the handwriting of a structural engineer, a bookkeeper, a person who understood data and had decided, in the absence of a system that would collect it accurately, to collect it herself. 18 months of time cards. 2 years of temperature readings. A running count of 47 injuries cross-referenced against equipment specifications that had not been updated in 10 years. All of it done on her own time. None of it requested. All of it real. Mrs. Carter, he said, can I ask you something? You've been asking things, she said. Keep going. Has anyone from this company, not the safety office, not your supervisor, anyone, ever sat down with you and asked what you know about this floor? She looked at him steadily. No, she said. In 6 years, in 6 years. He looked at the paper in his hand, then at the floor around them, the other workers, moving through their stations with the same practiced efficiency as Diane, the same specific fluency of people who had been doing this long enough to understand it from the inside in ways that no quarterly report could replicate. How many other workers on this floor have data like this? He said. Not formatted like this, Diane said, but knowledge, all of them. Every person on this floor knows things about this operation that are not in any report. She paused. They know which equipment runs hot in the 3rd hour of a shift. They know which section of the floor has the draft that makes the temperature gauge red low. They know which safety protocols work and which ones exist on paper because they were written by someone who has never stood where we stand. She looked at him. That knowledge exists. It's just never been asked for. Robert stood in the heat of the casting floor and looked at the paper in his hand and thought about 11 facilities across 3 states and 4,000 workers and 34 years of quarterly reports and efficiency metrics, and the specific, comfortable confidence of a man who had believed he understood his own company because the numbers said it was performing adequately. The numbers had been measuring what the forms could capture. The forms had been designed by people who didn't stand where Diane Carter stood. The gap between those two things was 47 injuries and 260 uncompensated hours per year per worker, and temperature readings that ran 6 to 10 degrees higher than the official measurement, and a set of glove specifications that had not been updated since the equipment they were meant to protect against had been upgraded. He folded the paper carefully, put it in his jacket pocket, "I'd like to keep this," he said. "If you're willing." "I made a copy," she said. Of course she had made a copy. "Of course, Carter," he said. "The question I came down here to ask. I didn't know I was going to ask it until right now." He paused. "If you were designing the safety system for this floor, not modifying the current one, designing from the beginning, what would it look like?" Diane Carter looked at him. Nobody had asked her that. In 6 years of working this floor, of reporting incidents on forms that didn't capture what had happened, of documenting temperature differentials and shift lengths and injury patterns on her own time. Because the system wasn't doing it. Not one person with the authority to change the system had ever sat across from her and asked her to design a better one. She was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, loading. The way a person loads when they have been holding a large, precise answer to a question for a very long time and have just been asked it for the first time. "First," she said, "you measure where the workers are, not where the sensors are, not the fixed 0.6 feet from the equipment where the workers actually stand." She looked at him steadily. "Everything else follows from that. If you measure the right thing, you get the right data. If you get the right data, you make the right decisions. If you make the right decisions, my hands look different in 6 more years." Robert looked at her hands, then at the paper in his pocket, then at the floor around him. 11.3 hours, 47 injuries, 260 uncompensated hours, temperature readings 6 to 10 degrees above the official measurement, glove specifications a decade out of date. All of it documented by a woman who had not been asked. All of it real. All of it fixable. Robert Haynes called his executive team at 2 p.m. Not from the conference rooms upstairs. From the parking lot of the Pittsburgh mill, sitting in his car with the engine off, the March cold coming through the glass in a way that the sealed climate of the building had not prepared him for. He had been on the floor for 4 hours. The quarterly review, Gary, had prepared the slides, the metrics, the carefully organized presentation of a facility performing adequately, was still on the conference room table upstairs, untouched. He had spent those 4 hours talking to workers. Not Gary, not the shift supervisors, not the safety officer, who had appeared at one point with a clipboard and the specific expression of someone who was not sure whether this visit was an inspection or something else and was preparing for both simultaneously. The workers. He had moved from station to station with Diane walking beside him, not as a guide, not as a translator who'd introduced the conversation and whose presence established for the other workers that this was a different kind of conversation than the ones that usually happened when someone in a suit appeared on the floor, different in a way they could feel before they could articulate it. Because Diane Carter had not performed anything for him, had not adjusted her language or her posture or the content of what she said based on who was listening, had described the temperature differentials and the glove specifications and the uncompensated hours with the same flat precision she would have used describing them to another worker, had held up her hands and not hidden them, and had answered his questions with the specific, unsentimental accuracy of someone who had long ago made peace with the truth, being what it was, regardless of whether anyone wanted to hear it. The other workers had watched that, and one by one, when Robert moved to their stations and asked the same kind of questions, not what the metrics showed, what they knew, they had told him. A man named Deshawn, 26 years old, 3 years on the floor, had shown him the section near the south wall where the ventilation ran inadequate in the summer months, and the heat index climbed past what the fixed sensors showed. He had been telling his supervisor about it for 2 years. It appeared in no report because the supervisor had assessed it as within tolerance, and the form did not have a field for within tolerance but worse than stated. A woman named Patricia, 51 years old, 17 years with Haynes Industrial across 3 different facilities, had described the way the mandatory overtime scheduling worked in practice. The phone call at 8 p.m., notifying workers of a schedule extension that the contract called flex time, and the workers called mandatory because refusing it 3 times in a quarter resulted in a performance note, and performance notes affected the annual review, and the annual review affected the raise, and the raise affected whether Patricia could cover her daughter's college tuition without a second job. She was working a second job on the weekends, 17 years with Haynes Industrial. Second job on the weekends. A man named Curtis, 44 years old, 11 years on the floor, had shown Robert the equipment maintenance log and pointed to the interval between scheduled maintenance on the primary rolling mechanism. 14 weeks extended from the previous 10-week interval in 2021 as a cost reduction measure implemented by the operations team in Philadelphia. Curtis had flagged the extension to his supervisor in writing. The supervisor had forwarded it to the operations team. The operations team had confirmed that the extension was within manufacturer guidelines and that the cost reduction was significant. Curtis had been tracking the equipment performance data since the extension. He showed Robert the log. The equipment was running within specification. It was running at the high end of specification continuously, with less recovery time between cycles. In a pattern that Curtis, who had been listening to this machinery for 11 years, described as the way a person sounds when they are working past comfortable and approaching limit. He had a notebook. Not as comprehensive as Diane's documentation, but a notebook. Dates, observations, the specific technical language of someone who had been living with this equipment long enough to understand it, in a way that a manufacturer guideline could not replicate. Robert sat in his car in the parking lot and looked at the 3 items on the passenger seat. Diane's folded paper, Deshawn's temperature documentation, handwritten on a piece of paper he'd pulled from his locker. Curtis's equipment log, copied on the break room photocopier while Robert waited. 3 workers, 3 notebooks, 3 sets of information that his quarterly reports did not contain. He called his executive team. His chief operating officer answered first. Sandra Park, 53, sharp. The person who managed the operational reality of Haynes Industrial's 11 facilities and who Robert trusted more than anyone else in the organization to tell him what was actually happening versus what he was being told was happening. Sandra, he said, I'm in Pittsburgh. A pause. You didn't have Pittsburgh scheduled. I know. I need you to tell me something honestly. I always tell you things honestly, she said, in the tone of someone who meant it and was also aware of the specific weight of the question that was coming. The temperature measurement protocol, he said. Fixed sensor, 6 feet from the equipment. Whose decision was that? Silence. Longer than the previous one. That's been the protocol since before I joined the company, Sandra said carefully. It's consistent with OSHA guidelines for ambient temperature measurement in industrial environments. Is it consistent with the temperature workers are actually exposed to at their stations? Another pause. Robert, Sandra said, what did you find? 6 to 10 degrees higher than the fixed sensor reading at the actual work position, he said. Documented by a worker who has been tracking it for 2 years because the reporting form doesn't have a field for position-specific readings. Silence. The glove specification, he said. Last reviewed 2019. Equipment upgraded 2014. The specification is compliant with the old equipment rating. It has not been updated for the current equipment surface temperature. More silence. Robert, Sandra said. 47 documented hand injuries on the Pittsburgh floor since the 2014 upgrade, he said. I would like to know how many of those would not have occurred with an updated glove specification.
I'll find out,
Sandra said. Her voice had shifted. Not defensive, recalibrating. The specific shift of a competent person receiving information that changes the shape of a problem they thought they understood. The flex time scheduling, Robert said. The workers call it mandatory overtime. I want to know whether the distinction between flex time and mandatory overtime in the current contract accurately reflects the consequences for workers who decline the extended shifts. That's a legal question, Sandra said. I'll get counsel involved. Today, Robert said. Today, she said. He looked at the items on the passenger seat, the paper, the handwritten temperature log, Curtis's equipment notebook. Sandra, he said, how many of our 11 facilities have workers who are documenting things that aren't in our reports? The silence this time was the longest. I don't know, she said. I need you to find out, he said, not by asking the plant managers, by asking the workers. He paused. Specifically, I need you to ask them what they know that they haven't been asked about. That's going to be a significant undertaking. Sandra said. I know, Robert said. I should have undertaken it 34 years ago. He looked out the windshield at the mill building. Start with Pittsburgh. I want to know everything Diane Carter knows, and Deshaun Williams, and Patricia Monroe, and Curtis Jackson. He had gotten their full names before he left the floor. He had not known their names 4 hours ago. He knew them now. Those are 4 workers who have been doing our safety research for us in their spare time, because our systems weren't capturing what they knew. I want to know what the other workers on that floor know. And then I want to do the same at every other facility. Sandra was quiet for a moment. This is going to surface things we haven't been accounting for, she said. I know, Robert said. The liability implications are less significant than the human implications, he said, which we should have been accounting for all along. He paused. Sandra, my father worked a mill for 31 years. I built this company on the labor of people like him. I have spent 34 years believing I was doing that responsibly, because the benchmarks said we were performing adequately. He looked at Diane's paper on the passenger seat. The benchmarks were measuring what the forms could capture. The forms were designed by people who don't stand where our workers stand. He let that sit. The gap between those two things, he said, is what I spent 4 hours on this floor today. I need you to help me understand the size of that gap across all 11 facilities. And then I need us to close it. Sandra was quiet for a long moment. I'll put a team together today, she said. Thank you, he said. He ended the call. He sat in the parking lot for a few more minutes. The mill building in front of him, the Pittsburgh skyline behind it. 8 miles from Braddock, where his father had come home every night, with the smell of steel work on him and the specific roughness of hands that had spent the day doing something real. Robert had driven past this exit 14 months ago. He had taken it today. He thought about what would have happened if he hadn't, if he had stayed on the 376 and gone back to Philadelphia and received the quarterly review in a scheduled call next week and looked at the numbers that said the Pittsburgh mill was performing adequately and believed them. 47 injuries, 11.3 hours, temperature readings 6 to 10 degrees above the official measurement. A woman who had saved his mill twice and whose contributions had been categorized as cost avoidance. A 9-year-old boy's drawing of his mother sleeping in the dark while the sun was out. None of it would have changed. He started the car. He drove back into Pittsburgh. He had a meeting to arrange, not with his executive team, not with the plant manager or the safety officer or anyone whose job it was to present him with the version of the facility that appeared in the quarterly reports, with Diane Carter. She had 40 minutes on her last break. He needed more than 40 minutes. He was going to ask her if she was willing to give him more, not as a favor, as work, paid work, the kind that reflected what the work was actually worth. She was at her locker when he found her. End of shift. 6 a.m. gear off, street clothes on, locker closed. The end of shift routine so embedded after 6 years it required no conscious attention. She was thinking about Marcus. Whether he had set his alarm for 7:15. He always did. She always thought about it anyway. Robert Haynes was standing in the corridor outside the locker room. Still in the suit, still in the mill. It was 6 a.m., and he had been here since before 11 the previous morning. She noted that the way she noted everything, accurately, without embellishment. I'd like to continue our conversation, he said. Not today. When you've slept. She kept moving. She had a bus in 11 minutes. Why? She said. Because what you've documented isn't informal notes, he said. It's operational research. 2 years of temperature data, 18 months of shift records. Injury patterns cross-referenced against equipment specifications that haven't been updated in a decade. He paused. That work deserves to be compensated. Not with a certificate, with a contract. She stopped, looked at him. Send it in writing, she said. Personal email, not the company system. I'll read it when I wake up. She started walking, and Mr. Haynes, he looked at her. If it's real, I'll hear it. If it's a commendation certificate with a dollar amount attached, don't waste my time. She was out the door before he could respond. The proposal arrived at 11 a.m. She read it at 6:30, sitting across from Marcus while he did his homework. 7 pages. She read it twice. It was not a certificate with a dollar amount attached. worker safety and operations advisor, a formal consulting role that had not existed at Haynes Industrial before today. Scope, comprehensive review of safety protocols, measurement systems, and compensation structures across all 11 facilities. Deliverable, structural recommendations developed in direct consultation with workers at each location. Timeline, 12 months. Compensation, a rate that reflected what the work was actually worth. She called her sister in Cleveland, who was a paralegal. 40 minutes later, her sister said, "This is real, Diane. You sure? The scope is real. The authority is real. The compensation is real." A pause. The question is whether they actually implement what you recommend or whether it becomes a report on a shelf. How do I know which one? You ask him, her sister said. Directly. She called Robert Haynes at 7:15. He answered on the second ring. "I have one question," she said. "When I submit recommendations that cost money, the ones that hit the quarterly margin, the ones your operations team pushes back on, what happens to them?" Silence. The real kind. Someone taking a question seriously enough to answer it honestly. "They get implemented," he said. "Why should I believe that?" "Because I'm making it contractually binding," he said. "Recommendations accepted by the review panel must be implemented within a defined timeline, or the company is in breach." A pause. "My legal team said it was unusual. I told them to draft it anyway." "The review panel," she said. "Who's on it?" "One worker representative per facility," he said. "Elected by their peers. Not appointed by management." She was quiet. 11 facilities. 11 workers. People who stood where she stood. Who had temperature logs and equipment notebooks and knowledge that had never appeared in a quarterly report. All of them asked. For the first time. "Mr. Haynes," she said. "Why is this time different?" The line was quiet for long enough that she knew he was not reaching for the easy answer. "Because I drove past this exit 14 months ago, and this morning I took it," he said. "Because I spent 4 hours on your floor and came away with more accurate information about my own facility than 34 years of quarterly reports have given me." He paused. "My father worked a mill for 31 years. His hands were rough the way your hands are scarred. I built this company on the labor of people like him and told myself I was doing it responsibly because the benchmarks said we were performing adequately." Another pause. "This morning I found out that adequate and responsible are not the same thing, and I am not willing to act as though I don't know that now." Diane looked at the proposal on the bed. She thought about the drawing in Marcus's notebook, her sleeping in the dark while the sun was out. Her son who had made it and not shown her because he was 9 years old and already understood that some truths were too heavy to hand directly to the person they were about. "I'll send you my counterterms by Friday," she said. Something released on the other end of the line. The specific sound of a person who has been holding something tense for a long time. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Read my counterterms first." She went back to the kitchen table, back to Marcus and his homework and the 90-minute window before her shift that she had protected for 6 years, because it was the only time the world was organized around the two of them being in the same room, in the same light, at the same time. "Well?" Marcus said without looking up. "Good," she said. "I think good." He nodded, went back to his homework. She sat across from him and thought, for the first time in 6 years, about what it would mean to be somewhere during the day. To see what he saw when he walked to the bus stop in the morning. To be awake when the sun was out. Not yet. But soon. The counterterms arrived Friday morning at 8 a.m. Robert was at his desk in Philadelphia when they came through. He had been there since 6:30, which was not unusual. What was unusual was what he had been doing since 6:30, not the quarterly reports, not the investor calls, not the accumulated administrative weight of running an 11-facility operation across 3 states. He had been reading Curtis's equipment log, Deshawn's temperature documentation, the injury cross-reference Diane had compiled over 2 years on her own time. He had been reading them the way he used to read things, before Haynes Industrial became the size it was, and reading became scanning. Slowly, with full attention, letting the data produce its full meaning rather than extracting the actionable summary and moving on. The full meaning was considerable. He opened Diane's counterterms. 4 pages. Her sister's legal training visible in the structure, precise, specific, leaving nothing to interpretation. He read them once for content and once for what they revealed about Diane Carter as a negotiator, which was the same thing they revealed about her as a worker and as a person who had spent 6 years documenting what the forms couldn't capture. She didn't ask for more than she had earned. She asked for exactly what she had earned, specified with a precision that made it impossible to offer less without explicitly acknowledging you were doing so. The compensation she had countered was higher than his proposal. She had attached a calculation. The rate reflected the market value of industrial safety consulting at the senior level, cross-referenced against the documented value of the 2 equipment failures she had prevented, the cost avoidance that had appeared in the safety commendation, and that she had now quantified specifically in dollars, using the maintenance cost estimates from the facility records she had access to as a floor worker. The cost avoidance from her 2 interventions was $3 million. Her proposed annual consulting rate was $94,000. He looked at those 2 numbers for a long time, then he accepted her terms without counter. He called Sandra Park. "The Pittsburgh Review starts Monday," he said. "I need you in the room." "I'll be there," Sandra said. "Robert, I've been going through the facility reports since Tuesday. Pittsburgh isn't the only one." "I know," he said. "The temperature measurement discrepancy exists at 6 of the 11 facilities. The glove specification issue is present at 8. The flex time classification." "Sandra," he said. She stopped. "Tell me on Monday," he said, "in Pittsburgh, with Diane Carter in the room." A pause. "All right," she said. He put the phone down. He looked at the window. Philadelphia below. Different skyline than Pittsburgh, different scale. The same fundamental fact of a city, organized around the labor of people whose names did not appear in the quarterly reports that described the operation of the facilities where they worked. He thought about his father. Thomas Haynes had retired from Edgar Thomson in 1998 with a pension that covered the basics and a hearing loss in his left ear that the audiologist described as consistent with prolonged industrial noise exposure, and that his father described as just part of it, the way he described everything about the work. Without complaint, without the expectation that complaint was available to him, with the specific, weathered acceptance of a man who had understood the deal he was in and had honored his side of it for 31 years. Just part of it. Robert had built a company on the labor of people who said just part of it. He had believed for 34 years that building the company well, efficiently, profitably, with safety metrics that met the benchmarks, was sufficient honor for what the labor cost. He had been wrong about that. Not entirely wrong. The efficiency was real. The profitability was real. The safety record, measured against the benchmarks, was genuinely better than the industry average. But the benchmarks measured what the forms captured. And the forms had been designed by people who had never stood at the actual work position, at the actual temperature, with the actual equipment. The gap between the benchmark and the reality was 47 injuries and 6 degrees of heat and 260 uncompensated hours, and a woman who had saved his mill twice and been given a certificate. That gap was his responsibility. He was going to close it. The Monday meeting lasted 6 hours, not in the conference room upstairs, where Gary Shields had prepared the quarterly review that had never happened. In the break room on the main floor, the room where workers ate their meals and spent their 30-minute breaks, and had, over the years, conducted the informal operational research that Robert's systems had not been designed to capture. Diane was there. Sandra Park was there. Gary Shields was there, with the expression of a man who had managed this facility for 7 years and was in the process of understanding that managing and seeing were not the same thing. And 7 other workers from the Pittsburgh floor were there. Not selected by management. Self-selected when Diane had sent a message through the informal network, the same network that had produced Deshawn's text about Robert sitting in the parking lot, asking who had documentation they'd been keeping and were willing to share. 7 people had shown up with notebooks. 7 notebooks. The meeting that followed was not a presentation. It was not a tour. It was not any of the formal structures that Robert had participated in hundreds of times at Haynes industrial facilities, and that had produced, reliably, the information that the structures were designed to produce. It was a conversation. 7 workers and 2 executives, and a plant manager sitting in a break room that smelled like coffee and the specific ambient warmth of a building where furnaces ran continuously, and the workers talking about what they knew and the executives listening and the plant manager learning in real time the difference between managing a floor and understanding one. Deshawn described the south wall ventilation issue, had been describing it to his supervisor for 2 years, had a folder. Patricia described the flex time scheduling in the specific, granular detail of someone who had been navigating its consequences for 17 years and understood every mechanism of it. Curtis opened his equipment, logged to the page where the maintenance interval change appeared, and walked Sandra Park through the performance data he had been tracking since the change. A woman named Beverly, 22 years on the floor, described the ergonomic issues, workstations, with the workstation design at the primary casting position, the specific cumulative physical cost of a posture that the equipment required, and that the equipment had never been redesigned to address because the people who designed the equipment did not spend 10 hours a night in the posture it demanded. She had documentation. Of course she did. By the time Beverly finished, Sandra Park had stopped taking notes. Not because she had stopped paying attention, because she was looking at Beverly's documentation, 3 years of her own medical records, tracking the specific progression of a repetitive stress injury that the facility's occupational health program had treated symptomatically without ever addressing the ergonomic source. And her expression had gone past note-taking into something that required both hands free and full attention. Beverly, Sandra said, has anyone from the company ever looked at your medical records in connection with the workstation design? No, Beverly said. Has anyone ever asked? No. Sandra looked at Robert. He looked back. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The 7 notebooks on the break room table said it. 6 hours, 7 workers, 7 notebooks. The specific accumulated knowledge of people who had been doing the company's safety research in their spare time because the company's systems weren't doing it. At the end of the meeting, Robert stood up. He did not give a speech. He was not good at speeches, and this was not a moment for one. He said what was true and what was immediate, and what the people in the room needed to hear, stated plainly by someone with the authority to make it real. The glove specification gets updated this week, he said. Sandra is handling it. New spec, based on the current equipment ratings, not the 2014 equipment ratings. New gloves ordered and delivered within 30 days. He looked at Deshawn. The south wall ventilation gets assessed by an independent engineer this week. If it's what you've documented, it gets fixed. Not scheduled, fixed. He looked at Patricia. The flex time classification goes to legal today. If the current contract language doesn't accurately reflect the consequences for workers who decline extended shifts, the language changes. And the back pay question, whether workers have been undercompensated for the hours classified as flex time, that gets answered, not buried. Answered. He looked at Curtis. The maintenance interval on the primary rolling mechanism goes back to 10 weeks, effective immediately. The cost reduction that extended it to 14 weeks did not account for the full cost. It is being reversed. He looked at Beverly. The workstation ergonomics assessment starts next month. Beverly, I'd like you to work directly with the assessment team, not as a subject, as an advisor. You have 3 years of documentation that no ergonomic engineer has seen. They need to see it before they design anything. Beverly looked at him. She had been at Haynes Industrial for 22 years. Nobody had ever asked her to advise anything. All right, she said. One word. The same register as Diane's not yet but not never. The specific, contained response of a person who has been waiting a long time for something and is not yet certain it is real and is not going to perform a reaction larger than the certainty warrants. Robert respected that. He looked at Diane. She was watching him with the same assessment expression she had worn on the floor when he first walked toward her, reading what was actually there. Not the performance of it, the thing itself. The worker panel, he said. 11 facilities, 11 representatives elected by their peers. First meeting in 6 weeks, you chair it. I chair it, she said. You chair it, he confirmed. She nodded once. Not gratitude. Confirmation. The specific nod of a person accepting a responsibility they have already decided they are capable of carrying. The meeting ended at 2 p.m. The workers filed out. Sandra stayed to work through the immediate action items. Gary Shields stayed with the expression of a man reorganizing his understanding of the facility he had managed for 7 years and finding the reorganization both uncomfortable and overdue. Robert stood at the break room window, the casting floor visible through the glass. Full operation, the heat shimmer above the equipment. The workers at their stations moving with the practiced fluency of people who understood the work from the inside. 4,000 workers, 11 facilities, 34 years, all of it still here, all of it still fixable. He thought about Diane's counterterms, the to-do, $3 million in cost avoidance she had quantified, the $94,000 annual rate she had proposed, the calculation she had attached that made it impossible to offer less without explicitly acknowledging you were doing so. He thought about the 7 notebooks on the break room table. 7 workers who had been doing the company's safety research in their spare time for years, without being asked. He thought about what it would have cost in injuries, in uncompensated hours, in the specific accumulated price of a gap between the benchmark and the reality. If he had stayed on the 376 and driven past the Pittsburgh exit 14 months ago and last Tuesday, he had taken the exit last Tuesday. He was going to keep taking it. The contract was signed on a Wednesday. Diane did it at the kitchen table at 6:45 p.m. with Marcus. Mark sitting across from her finishing his homework and not asking what she was signing because he had learned in 9 years to read the quality of her focus when it meant don't interrupt and when it meant you can ask. This was a don't interrupt moment. She signed her name on the last page, put the pen down, looked at the signature for a moment. Diane Carter, Worker Safety and Operations Advisor. Haynes Industrial Group. She had not told Marcus yet. Not the full version. Not the contract. Not the title. Not the compensation that would change the morning math in ways she had not yet fully allowed herself to absorb. She had told him only that something at work was changing, that she might be switching to day shifts, that things were going to look different. He had looked up from his homework. Day shifts, he said. Maybe, she said. We'll see. He had gone back to his homework without another word, but she had seen his face in that half second. The specific expression of a 9-year-old boy receiving information that was too significant to process quickly and too important to respond to carelessly. The expression of a child who had spent 3 years getting himself to school at 7:15 and making his own breakfast and not asking why his mother slept during the day, absorbing all of it without complaint, without the kind of expressed need that would have made it easier to address. Hearing for the first time that the shape of things might change. She had put the drawing back in his notebook the night she found it. She had never told him she had seen it. She told him now. Marcus, she said. He looked up. The drawing, she said. The one you put in the back of your second notebook. Me sleeping. The sun in the window. He went still. Not guilty. Still. The stillness of a child who has been found out about something they were not sure they should have done and are waiting to understand whether what they did was wrong. I found it 3 months ago, she said. I put it back. He said nothing. I want you to know that I saw it, she said, and I want you to know what it cost me to see it. She paused, not performing emotion, stating fact, the way she stated everything. You drew that because you understood something about our life that I had hoped you didn't fully understand yet. And you put it in the back of the notebook instead of showing me because you were trying to protect me from knowing that you understood it. She looked at her son. You are 9 years old and you were trying to protect me. Marcus looked at the table. I didn't want you to feel bad, he said. I know, she said. That's the part that got me. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. He looked at her hand, the scars running across the palm, the specific record of 6 years written directly onto skin, and he looked at it the way he looked at things he was drawing, carefully, with full attention. Is it going to be okay? He said. She thought about the contract on the table beside her. The 7 notebooks in a Pittsburgh break room, the glove specification being updated this week. The maintenance interval reversed. Beverly advising the ergonomics assessment. 11 worker representatives being elected across 11 facilities. The morning math producing a different answer. Yes, she said. It's going to be okay. He nodded, went back to his homework. She sat across from him and let the quiet be what it was. The last night shift was a Thursday. She had not made an announcement about it, had not told the other workers it was her last night on the floor in that capacity. She would be back in the advisory role, in a different relationship to the same floor. But this specific version of Thursday nights at Haynes Industrial Pittsburgh, the 10-hour shift at the rolling mill, the 9:47 p.m. alarm, and the bus ride and the gear in the locker, and the temperature that ran 6 degrees above the official reading at the actual work position, this version was ending. She did her job. The full shift. 10 hours. The same practiced fluency she had brought to every shift for 6 years. The same continuous monitoring of the machinery. The same specific attention to the sounds that weren't quite right before the systems flagged them. At 5:58 a.m., 2 minutes before shift end, she performed her end-of-station check. Equipment status, normal. Output log, complete. Incident report, none. She pulled off her gloves. She looked at her hands. The scars were still there, would always be there, not as damage exactly, or not only as damage, as record. The specific indelible record of 6 years of work done honestly, in conditions that the benchmarks had described as adequate, at a cost that the forms had not been designed to capture. The record was accurate. She had made sure of that. Deshawn was at the next station. He saw her looking at her hands, and he nodded. The specific wordless nod of someone who understood what the moment was without needing it explained. She nodded back. She put the gloves on the station. She walked to the locker room for the last time as a floor worker, and she changed out of her gear, and she picked up her bag, and she walked out of the Pittsburgh mill into a Friday morning in April. The sun was up. Not rising, up. Full, clear, the specific quality of early morning light in Pittsburgh in April that came off the river and hit the buildings at an angle that made the city look, for about 40 minutes, like it was lit from the inside. She stood on the sidewalk outside the mill and looked at it. She had not seen this light in 6 years, not because it hadn't existed. But she had always been going in the other direction, arriving at midnight, leaving at 6, the city in darkness when she entered it, and in the early gray of pre-dawn when she left. The full morning light had been happening without her, the way most daytime things had been happening without her. On the other side of the schedule that the job required, she stood in it now. Let it be what it was. Then she took out her phone and called Robert Haynes. He answered on the second ring. It was 6:02 a.m., and he was already at his desk, which no longer surprised her. "It's done," she said. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like someone who finished a long job well," she said, "and is about to start a different one." "That's exactly what you are," he said. She looked at the mill building behind her, the Pittsburgh skyline beyond it. 8 miles from Braddock, where Robert's father had come home every night, with the smell of steelwork on him, and the roughness of hands that had spent the day doing something real. "Mr. Haynes," she said. "Robert," he said. "You can call me Robert." "Robert," she said. "The 11 facilities, the worker panel, the recommendations that have to be implemented, or the company is in breach." She paused. "When we're done, when the 12 months are up and the report is submitted and the structural changes are in place, what happens to the workers who helped build it? The ones who brought their notebooks to the break room table?" "What do you mean?" he said. "I mean Beverly," she said. 22 years on the floor. 3 years of medical documentation that no ergonomic engineer had seen. She advised the assessment team, which is real and significant, but she still goes back to the floor. She paused. The knowledge doesn't go away when the review ends. The question is whether the company keeps asking for it, or whether the notebooks go back in the drawer and the forms go back to capturing what the forms can capture. He was quiet. "I've been thinking about that," he said. "And? I want to build something permanent," he said, "not a one-year review. A standing structure. Worker safety advisors at every facility, elected by peers, with a formal role in the ongoing operation of the facility, not consultants. Employees, with compensation that reflects the value of what they know." He paused. "I want it in the next contract negotiation, written into the labor agreement so it doesn't depend on who's sitting in my chair." She stood on the sidewalk in the morning light, not performing anything, just standing in it, absorbing what it meant that a company with $4 billion in revenue and 11 facilities and 34 years of quarterly reports, was about to start measuring the things the benchmarks had not been measuring. Because a woman who worked nights had documented what the forms couldn't capture. Because 7 workers had brought their notebooks to a break room to table. Because a man in a $3,000 suit had taken an exit he had driven past for 14 months. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "All right," she confirmed. "I'll see you Monday." She ended the call. She looked at the time, 6:08 a.m. Marcus's alarm went off at 7:15. She had over an hour. She started walking. Not toward the bus stop. Toward home, on foot. Through a Pittsburgh morning that was fully alive around her. The city in the specific energized motion of a workday beginning. People moving through it with their own math running in their own heads, their own costs and calculations, and the accumulated weight of what their work required of them. She walked through all of it. In the morning light. For the first time in 6 years. 40 minutes later, she turned the key in her apartment door and stepped inside. The apartment quiet. Marcus still asleep. The drawing notebook on his nightstand. His alarm set for 7:15. She went to his doorway. She stood there the way she always stood there. Long enough to see the steady rise and fall of his breathing. Present, safe, sleeping. But this time she stayed. She didn't leave for work. She went to the kitchen, made coffee, sat down at the table, and waited. At 7:12, 3 minutes before his alarm, Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway. He saw her. He stopped. He looked at his mother sitting at the kitchen table in the morning light with a cup of coffee, present, awake, not in her work clothes, not about to leave, just there, in the kitchen, at 7:12 in the morning. He stood in the doorway and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "You're here." "I'm here," she said. He came to the table, sat down across from her. The way they sat at 6:30 p.m., during the 90-minute window, the two of them in the same light at the same time, except it was morning. The sun coming through the kitchen window, full and clear, the same sun he had drawn in the window of her room 3 months ago, while she slept. She was not sleeping now. She poured him a glass of orange juice. He looked at it. "Is this going to be regular?" he said. "Yes," she said. "It's going to be regular." He nodded. He picked up the glass. Outside, Pittsburgh was fully awake. The mill 8 miles south, running its first shift. The casting floor at its operating temperature. The rolling mechanism on its revised maintenance schedule. The temperature sensors being repositioned to the actual work coordinates as of this week. The new glove specifications on order. Beverly's ergonomics assessment beginning next month. All of it still here. All of it changing. Marcus drank his orange juice. Diane drank her coffee. The morning light came through the window and fell across the kitchen table between them, ordinary and complete. The kind of light that had been there every morning for 6 years. She had just never been awake to see it. 6 months later, the Pittsburgh mill ran its first full quarter under the new safety standards. The temperature sensors had been repositioned to the actual work coordinates. The glove specifications had been updated. The maintenance intervals were back to 10. The flex time reclassification had produced back pay for 847 workers across 6 facilities. Not a settlement, not a gesture, a correction. The numbers reflected it. Not just safety numbers, the ones that hadn't been measured before. Position-specific temperature compliance, 97%. Unreported incident rate, tracked now through a new anonymous system Diane had designed, down 64% in the first quarter. Worker retention across the 11 facilities, up for the first time in 7 years. The benchmarks had changed. Because the forms had changed. Because the forms had been redesigned by people who stood where the workers stood. Diane chaired the first full worker panel meeting on a Tuesday morning. 11 representatives, 11 facilities, 11 people who had been keeping notebooks in their own time. Because the system wasn't doing it. Now in a room together, paid, with a seat at the table that was written into the labor agreement and didn't depend on who was sitting in the CEO's chair. Beverly presented the ergonomics findings. 22 years on the floor. First time anyone had asked. Robert stood at the back of the room and did not speak. He had learned, in 6 months, that his most useful contribution to these meetings was listening. The people in the room knew more about the operation of his facilities than he did. His job was to make sure what they knew had somewhere to go. That night, Marcus showed his mother a new drawing. He had framed it himself with cardboard and tape, the careful construction of a boy who understood that some things deserved to be kept properly. Two figures at a kitchen table. Morning light coming through the window. Both of them awake.